The air in the dining room at Belle Rive was thick. It was so heavy you could almost touch it. It felt like the humid summer heat before a terrible storm. Father sat at the head of the long, polished table. His face was a thundercloud. Mother sat at the other end, her hands twisting a white napkin in her lap. Between them sat the two brothers, Ethan and Liam. They were the reason for the storm. Ethan looked at his plate, but he could not eat. The roasted chicken tasted like ash in his mouth. He felt his brother's anger across the table. It was a physical thing, a heat that burned the air. The silence was louder than any shout, a screaming quiet that filled every corner of the grand room.
It is our way of life, Ethan. These abolitionists in the North, they know nothing of our traditions. They want to tear down everything our family has built.
He gestured around the room at the fine curtains and the silver candlesticks. He meant the plantation, the fields of cotton, the very ground they stood on. Ethan shook his head slowly. He did not look up. He could not meet his brother's gaze. "It is not a way of life, Liam," he answered, his voice low but firm. "It is a system built on the backs of others. It is a sin in the eyes of God." Father slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses jump. "Enough!" From the corner of the room, a young enslaved woman named Abigail watched. She held a silver pitcher of water, her body still as a statue. She had heard these arguments before. They were whispers at first, but now they were shouts that echoed through the great house. She saw the pain in Ethan's face. She saw the fire in Liam's. She understood what they were truly arguing about. They were arguing about her mother in the kitchens, about her father in the fields. They were arguing about her future and the future of her people. But they never asked her what she thought. To them, she was just a part of the scenery, like the wallpaper or the heavy oak furniture.
Her heart beat a quiet, steady rhythm of fear and a tiny, buried spark of hope.
The argument raged on, a fire that could not be put out. Words became weapons.
"Traitor," Liam hissed at his brother. "You stand with the enemy."
Ethan finally looked up, his own eyes filled with a deep sadness. "The only enemy I see is the one that puts chains on another human being. If that makes me a traitor to your cause, then so be it." He pushed his chair back and stood up, his napkin falling to the floor. The family was broken, the house was divided. Outside the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of red and orange, like a wound that would not heal. The storm was no longer coming, it had arrived. The news came like a flood. South Carolina had seceded. Other states followed, like dominoes falling one by one. The country was tearing itself apart. In the town square, men gathered in angry knots. They shouted about states' rights and honor. Flags with a new pattern of stars were raised high. The sound of drums began to beat, a steady, insistent rhythm that called young men to war.
Liam was one of the first to answer the call. He stood tall and proud in his new gray uniform. He believed he was fighting to protect his home, his family, and his heritage. He saw glory in the fight, a grand adventure waiting to unfold.
Ethan watched the parades from a distance. He saw the excitement in the eyes of the boys marching off to join the Confederacy. He did not see glory. He saw a terrible, bloody mistake. One night, he packed a small bag. He wrote a short note to his mother, and another to Sarah, the woman he loved. He did not write to his father or his brother. There were no words left for them. Under the cover of darkness, he rode north. He crossed rivers and slept in forests, his heart heavy with every mile that separated him from his home. He was not running away. He was running toward what he believed was right. He was going to fight to hold the nation together, and to end the institution that had torn his own family apart.
Back at Belle Rive, Sarah read Ethan's letter. Her hands trembled. His words were full of love for her, but also a deep conviction. He had to go. He had to fight for a better world. She looked out over the fields, where people were still forced to work from sunrise to sunset. She understood his choice, but it did not stop the fear that clutched at her heart. Would she ever see him again?
Meanwhile, Liam's letters arrived, full of bravado and stories of camp life. He wrote of the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers. He promised a swift victory and a triumphant return.
Two brothers, two armies, two different dreams for the future of their country. The nation was now two separate lands, one in blue, one in gray. The letters that crossed the battle lines were like messages from another world. Ethan learned to march, to load a rifle, to sleep on the hard ground. He wore the blue uniform of the Union. He fought for a country united and for freedom for all.
Liam learned the same skills, but he wore the gray of the Confederacy. He fought for the independence of the South and for the preservation of its way of life.
The brothers who had once shared a room now shared only the sky above them. They were marching toward the same battles on opposite sides of the line. They were marching to find each other in the smoke and chaos of war. The day broke gray and misty. The armies met near a little creek in Maryland called Antietam. The air was cool, but soon it would be hot with gunpowder and blood. Ethan's regiment was ordered to advance across a cornfield. The cornstalks were high, hiding the enemy. They marched forward, their blue uniforms a stark target against the green and gold of the field. The world exploded. A volley of rifle fire cut through the air, a sound like 1,000 angry hornets. Men fell around Ethan. Their cries were lost in the roar of the cannons. The cornstalks were shredded by bullets, revealing the long line of gray-clad soldiers waiting for them. Ethan dropped to one knee and returned fire. His hands moved automatically, tearing the paper cartridge with his teeth, pouring the powder down the barrel, ramming the bullet home. He aimed his rifle, but he did not see uniforms. He saw men. He saw boys, some no older than himself with fear in their eyes. A young Confederate soldier fell not 10 feet from him, his face turned toward the sky. For a moment their eyes met. There was no hatred there, only surprise and pain. Ethan felt a sickness in his stomach. This was not glory, this was butchery. He was a farmer's son, not a killer. But if he did not kill, he would be killed. The battle raged for hours. The sun beat down on the field, which was no longer a cornfield but a slaughter pen. The creek ran red with blood. Ethan fought with a desperate clarity. He was not fighting for a flag or a president. He was fighting for the man next to him. He was fighting to stay alive.
He saw a Union officer fall from his horse, his leg shattered. Without thinking, Ethan rushed forward, dragging the wounded man behind the meager cover of a fallen log. He tore a strip from his own shirt to make a tourniquet, his hands working quickly to stop the bleeding. "Thank you, son," he whispered.
As the day wore on, the fighting moved toward a sunken road. The Confederates held the high ground, pouring a relentless fire down on the Union troops. The noise was deafening, a constant, mind-numbing roar of cannons and rifles. Ethan felt something hit his shoulder, a force that spun him around and threw him to the ground. A searing pain shot through his body. He lay in the mud and the blood, the sounds of the battle fading around him. He thought of home. He thought of his mother, of Sarah. And he thought of Liam. Was his brother somewhere in this hell? Was he aiming a rifle at that very moment? The thought was more painful than the bullet in his shoulder. At Belle Rive, the days passed with a slow, agonizing rhythm. The war was a distant thunder, a story read from newspapers that were weeks old. But for Sarah and for Ethan's mother, Eleanor, the war was in their hearts every moment. They waited for letters. Every knock at the door, every rider coming up the long drive brought a jolt of hope and fear. Was it news? Was he safe?
Liam's letters came more frequently at first. They were full of confidence, of certainty that the South would win. But as the months turned into years, the tone of his letters began to change. The bold descriptions of camp life were replaced by short, weary notes about bad food and endless marching.
Sarah spent her days helping Eleanor manage the plantation. With the men gone, the women had to take on new roles. Sarah learned to oversee the planting and the harvesting, to manage the accounts, to make decisions that had always been made by men. She found a strength in herself she never knew she had. But at night, alone in her room, she would read Ethan's old letters. His words were a lifeline, a reminder of the man he was and the ideals he was fighting for. She worried for him constantly. The newspapers printed long lists of the dead and wounded after every major battle. She would scan the columns, her heart pounding, praying she would not find his name there.
Abigail watched the women of the great house. She saw their worry and their strength. Her own life was also filled with waiting, but her hope was different. The rumors of the war came to the slave quarters in whispers. They were carried by travelers, by other enslaved people, by the wind itself. The word was freedom. President Lincoln had signed something called the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a word that was almost too big to believe, a dream that people had only dared to whisper in the dark. While Sarah and Eleanor prayed for the safe return of their soldiers, Abigail and her community prayed for the victory of the blue-coated army. Their futures depended on it.
One afternoon a letter arrived with a strange postmark. It was not from Ethan. It was from a Union Army hospital in Maryland. Eleanor's hands shook so badly she could not open it.
Sarah took the letter and broke the seal. Her eyes flew across the page. Ethan was alive. He had been wounded at a place called Antietam. The relief was so great it made her dizzy, but it was followed by a new wave of fear. Wounded. How badly? The letter gave few details.
The war was no longer a distant thunder. It had reached out and touched them, leaving a scar of uncertainty and fear. The waiting was not over. It had only entered a new, more frightening chapter. The siege of Petersburg was a slow, grinding misery. The two armies had dug into the earth, facing each other across a desolate no-man's land of mud and craters. The grand sweeping battles were over. Now it was, well, a war of trenches, of sharpshooters, and of starvation. Liam was here. His gray uniform was tattered and stained. The boy who had gone to war seeking glory was gone. In his place was a man, thin and exhausted, his eyes haunted by the things he had seen. He and his comrades were hungry. Their supplies were cut off. Their hope was dwindling with every passing day. They were trapped, just waiting for the end. Ethan was also at Petersburg. His shoulder had healed, leaving a puckered scar and a permanent ache. He was no longer the idealistic boy who had ridden north. The war had hardened him. He had seen too much death, too much suffering. He understood now that victory would not be clean or glorious. It would be bought with a terrible price. His regiment was part of the vast Union army that surrounded the city. They had plenty of food and ammunition. They knew it was only a matter of time. But the waiting was a kind of torture, a slow tightening of a noose around the neck of the Confederacy. One rainy night, during a lull in the fighting, Ethan was on patrol in the forward trenches. The world was a maze of mud and darkness. He heard a sound from the Confederate side, a soft groan of pain. Against orders, against all common sense, he crawled out of his trench and into the dangerous space between the lines. He found a Confederate soldier lying in a shell crater, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The soldier was delirious with fever. Ethan gave him a drink from his canteen. As he wiped the mud from the man's face, his heart stopped. He knew that face. It was thinner, bearded, and etched with pain, but he knew it. It was Liam. Liam's eyes fluttered open. He stared at the blue uniform of the man leaning over him. For a moment, confusion and hatred flickered in his eyes. Then he recognized his brother. All the years of anger, all the politics, all the flags and the causes, they all melted away in that moment. They were not a Yankee and a rebel. They were just two brothers, lost in the mud and the dark. Ethan gently lifted Liam's head.
"I'm here, Liam, I'm here."
There was no victory in that trench. There was only shared pain and a profound, heartbreaking sorrow for what they had become. The war had brought them together at last, but only in their shared ruin. The Union Field Hospital was a city of white canvas tents. It smelled of carbolic acid, blood, and human suffering. Ethan had managed to get Liam carried back to the Union lines, claiming he was a deserter who could provide information. It was a lie, but it was a lie that saved his brother's life. Liam lay on a narrow cot, his broken leg bound in splints. The fever was still on him, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. Ethan sat by his side, refusing to leave. He was a patient himself, his old shoulder wound aching in the damp air, but his own pain was nothing compared to the turmoil in his soul. He watched the surgeons and nurses move through the ward. They were overworked and exhausted, their aprons stained with blood. They treated the men in blue and the men in gray with the same hurried professional care. Here, in this tent of pain, the uniforms did not seem to matter as much. A wound was a wound. A life was a life. Ethan saw a nurse, a woman with a kind but tired face, gently giving water to a boy from Alabama. The boy could not have been more than 16. He was crying for his mother. The war had been stripped of all its flags and speeches. It was reduced to this, a tent full of broken bodies and shattered dreams. When Liam was awake, he was quiet. The fire and anger were gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, hollow weariness. He would look at Ethan and then look away, as if ashamed.
"You should have left me out there. I'm the enemy."
Ethan shook his head.
"You are my brother."
There was nothing else to say. They did not talk about the war. They did not talk about slavery or states' rights. They talked about home. They remembered fishing in the creek as boys and climbing the big oak tree behind the stables. They talked about their mother's cooking. These small shared memories were the only bridge that could span the chasm the war had created between them. One day a surgeon came to examine Liam's leg.
"The bone is badly shattered. It will have to be amputated."
The news fell like a stone in the quiet tent. Liam closed his eyes, his face pale. The war would take his leg, his cause was lost, his world was destroyed. But as he lay there, he felt Ethan's hand on his arm. It was a steady, reassuring pressure. He had lost so much, but he was not alone. In the midst of all the death and destruction, a small, fragile seed of connection had been replanted. The war had taken everything from them, but in this quiet hospital tent, it had also, strangely, given them back to each other. The journey home was long and slow. The war was over. The country was scarred but whole again. Ethan, honorably discharged, supported Liam as they made their way back to Virginia. Liam leaned heavily on a crude wooden crutch, his gray uniform exchanged for plain civilian clothes. Belle Rive was still standing, but it was a shadow of its former self. The fields were overgrown with weeds, fences were broken, and a ghostly quiet hung over the place. Their father had died during the final year of the war, his heart broken by the loss of his cause. Eleanor and Sarah met them on the porch. The reunion was not one of triumphant joy but of quiet, tearful relief. The world they returned to was completely different. The foundation of Belle Rive, the institution of slavery, was gone. The people who had been enslaved were now free. One morning, Ethan found Abigail sitting on the steps of her former cabin, reading a book. He was surprised. He had never known she could read. She told him that a teacher from the Freedmen's Bureau had been giving lessons. Her eyes shone with a light he had never seen before.
We are free now, Mr. Ethan. We will make our own way. We will have our own future.
He saw then that the end of the war was not just an end, it was a beginning. Liam struggled with this new world. He sat on the porch for hours, staring out at the fallow fields. He saw only loss. He saw the end of his family's legacy. He was bitter and angry, not just about his leg but about the death of his world. Ethan tried to talk to him, but Liam would not listen. One evening, Sarah came and sat with Liam. She did not argue with him. She just told him stories about the hardships of the past few years, about her own fears and her newfound strength. She spoke of Ethan's letters, and the hope for a better world that had kept him going.
The past is gone, Liam. We cannot live there. We have to build something new right here.
Slowly, very slowly, something began to shift in Liam. He watched Abigail and the other former slaves working together, clearing a small plot of land for themselves. They were not working under the threat of a whip. They were working for their own future. He saw Ethan, his own brother, offering to help them, sharing tools and knowledge. He saw cooperation where there had once been only command. One day, Ethan was trying to fix a broken plow by himself. Liam hobbled over. He did not say a word. He just picked up a tool and started to help. It was a small gesture, but it was a start. On the ruins of the old plantation, a new relationship was beginning to grow. One built not on ownership, but on shared humanity. The first spring after the war was beautiful. The dogwood trees bloomed in a riot of white and pink, as if trying to cover the scars on the land. Life at Belle Rive had found a new, uncertain rhythm. It was no longer a plantation. It was just a farm, a very large broken farm. Ethan and Liam worked side by side in the fields. The work was hard, back-breaking labor. There were no longer hundreds of hands to do the work. There were only 4, but as they worked, they talked. They talked more than they had in years. They did not always agree, but they listened. The deep wounds between them were beginning to heal, slowly, like the wounded land around them. Sarah and Ethan were married in the small local church. It was a simple ceremony. Abigail and her family were there. They did not sit in the back gallery as they would have before the war. They sat in the pews as free citizens. It was a sign that the world was truly changing. After the ceremony, Sarah stood with Ethan on the porch of Belle Rive. She looked out at the fields, where new green shoots were pushing up through the dark soil.
It will be a hard life, but it will be our life, and it will be a just one.
Ethan took her hand. He knew she was right. They would build a new future, one seed, one day at a time. Liam eventually sold off most of the land. He gave a portion of it to Abigail's family and the other families who had worked the plantation for generations. It was his way of making amends, his own quiet act of repentance. He kept the main house and a small farm for himself. He never married. He remained a quiet, thoughtful man, a man forever marked by the war. But the bitterness in his eyes was replaced by a kind of peace. He had found a different kind of honor, not in fighting for a lost cause but in helping to build a better future. He and Ethan remained close, their bond forged not in the innocence of childhood, but in the fire of war and the grace of forgiveness. The story of the two brothers became a quiet legend in their small community. It was a story of a house divided and a family torn apart. But it was also a story of reunion and rebuilding. It was a reminder that even after the most terrible of storms, the sun can rise again. It was a testament to the idea that forgiveness is stronger than hatred, and that hope can plant seeds in the most desolate of ground. The war had sundered the stars on the flag, but now they were being stitched back together, one human heart at a time. A new America was being born, painful and slow, from the ashes of the old. It was a new beginning, full of struggle but also full of promise.